Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we convene our Middle East Roundtable for a discussion of the somewhat surprising outcome of Iran's presidential election. Our guests are Haleh Esfandiari, Director of the Center's Middle East Program; David Ottaway, a former Cairo bureau chief for the Washington Post and a current senior scholar with the Middle East Program; also, Afshin Mola, author of the critically acclaimed book, Soul of Iran, and now a senior research fellow with the New America Foundation. Welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I have to start on the air where we were just speaking off the air about the surprising element of this election. I think we compared notes and learned that none of us encountered anyone who didn't believe there would be a runoff and that this program would not be possible during this tape date today because we'd still be counting votes. Why did it turn out the way it is now that we have the benefit of hindsight? What were the forces that led Rouhani on the first ballot to receive over 50% of the vote? Haleh, let's begin with you.
Let me repeat that we were all taken by surprise. But I think the reason why Rouhani made it in the first round was the support and endorsement he got by two former presidents, Khatami and Rafsanjani. And because the Guardian Council had disqualified Rafsanjani, it was expected that less and less reformist people will vote. But once he came out and he said, I endorse Rouhani, and a number of the reformist leadership, even those who were in jail, managed to send out messages that we should all endorse Rouhani. So that added to the number of votes that he got.
That's really interesting. I think an American audience might be surprised about that because conventional wisdom here is that endorsements don't matter. And in this case, you're saying the endorsements could have been the key.
It did matter, and it mattered a great deal.
Right, no, I agree. It certainly mattered. And I think to some extent, these elections played out a familiar pattern in Iranian elections. It's important to note that Iranian elections, as you know, and as many of your viewers instinctively know, are never entirely free and fair because there's a Guardians Council that vets candidates, so you have pre-approved regime insiders. Now, but among those pre-approved regime insiders, you generally have genuine electoral contests, right? And the anomaly being 2009, where there was very clear indication that there was fraud. So this election kind of fit a familiar pattern as when Iranians were given a choice between a change candidate or status quo candidates, Iranians chose the change candidate. In this case, the change candidate happened to be a somewhat of a centrist figure. He was embraced by the reform camp, and so that fits a familiar pattern. I think that part of it shouldn't have surprised us. I think what surprised us is that there was no fraud, because we thought that in 2009 this new pattern had been set, and elections, these electoral contests, no matter how limited they were no longer going to be electoral contests. But in 2013, we had a real electoral contest.
Afshin, how do we know there was no fraud?
In the 2013 election, yeah, we don't, but and I suppose we never will. But I think they indicted themselves with the 2009 election to some extent with these 2013 elections because, as you know, they count ballots by hand in Iran, which is why we never really know the results until 24 hours later, sometimes 2 days later. In the 2009 election, they counted 50 million ballots in 1 hour. Right. In the 2013 election, it took time. It took time.
But the other factor here was an incredibly high turnout. Was 72%.
That's right.
So, which was not expected.
Which I think definitely these were those hoping for a major reform and backing Rouhani. I mean, so. Even the Ayatollah Khamenei was happy with the turnout. So you have really everybody happy with it, and I think that definitely helped to moderate.
But to put this in context, we're not talking about a firebrand reformer here. We're talking about someone who's part of the status quo, part of the establishment, but more moderate than the other candidates, correct?
Sure. Look, Rouhani has been part of the system since the inception of the Islamic Republic. He joined parliament in 1980 and stayed there for 5 terms. He was vice speaker of the parliament, you know. But if you look at his career, he always stayed out of the limelight. He is a member of the Expediency Council, working very closely with Rafsanjani. He is a member of the Assembly of Experts, an assembly that once Khamenei dies, decides who the next leader is going to be. He was on the National Security Council. He was a nuclear negotiator, but always out of the limelight. So he was not. The only controversial thing about him is that in 1999, when they were the student demonstrations and the government clamped down on them really savagely, he condoned it. He at least tried to justify it. While in 2009, he more or less didn't say anything, you know.
Because he's spent much of his career out of the limelight, as you put it, then how well do we know him, or how well do the Iranian people know him?
You know, I think the Iranian people have gotten to know him a little bit better. For the Iranian people saw him as someone who would hit the headlines, particularly in the 2003 to 2005 period when he was the nuclear negotiator, the chief nuclear negotiator. And I think to some extent, Supreme Leader Khamenei is comfortable with Rouhani, despite the fact that they may have different worldviews on two levels. Number one, he's a cleric. You know, and in a sense, this is the return of the clerics to the presidency, no longer a layperson, a populo-fascist like Ahmadinejad, who actually challenged the supreme leader in a very significant way. So a cleric returns to the presidency. But also, this is a man who's seen as a problem solver, and Iran has a big problem. Sanctions, economic crisis, the nuclear program. This election, in many ways, the Iranian people were facing a dead end, but the Iranian government was also facing a dead end. And Rouhani is someone who's seen as someone who might be able to walk Iran back from that dead end.
We did an interview with Haleh for a web feature we call Context that we sometimes feature on this program. And we posted it to our Facebook page, among others. And I was reading through the comments, and I got into a bit of an exchange with some of the Facebook commenters, and we posed it as a question. Mm-hmm. Does this election change the equation? Is this a rebirth of a reform movement in Iran? To a person, everyone who's commented has been very negative and very cynical and very pessimistic, saying the supreme leader is still in charge. This is window dressing. How should we look at this? Is that a fair I'm getting a sense from the three of you that you may think there are other possibilities.
Well, I think we're all concerned that there's going to be efforts to sabotage him. In fact, we were discussing earlier, there are already indications of people trying to sabotage
from
him.
Within Iran.
From within Iran, from within the leadership. And given the struggle between the clerics and the Revolutionary Guard, you wonder whether the Revolutionary Guard isn't going to try to work to undermine him. And he's got plenty of enemies within the system. So,
does having been an outsider or living sort of with a low profile, does that mean he may not have constituencies within these various groups because he's stayed out of the limelight?
He certainly has a public constituency. Whether he has control of any of the levers of power still, I have my doubts.
To some extent, the way I see it is that his role in the Supreme Leader's eyes is to help ameliorate Iran's bleeding red balance sheet. You know, Iran has lost 2/3 of its oil exports as a result of sanctions. They're losing anywhere from $3 to $5 billion a month as a result of sanctions. Even the oil that gets to market, they're having a hard time getting paid for that oil because of international banking sanctions on Iran. There is this spider web of sanctions that has captured the Iranian economy. And if you're Supreme Leader Khamenei, right, you see that balance sheet, you know, and you think that, okay, Rouhani, let's see what you can do to help us. But Supreme
Iran
Leader
didn't elect an accountant; they elected a cleric.
Right. And a cleric who's kind of seen by the Supreme Leader as a problem solver, seen by the population as a problem solver. But what the Supreme Leader is not saying to Rouhani, he's not saying, go give us reformist democracy. He's saying, go solve this problem for us.
Reform the economy, not the democracy.
Yeah. But if you look at his campaign, the speeches he gave during the campaign, he criticized a lot the economic policy of Ahmadinejad's government, you know, and he brought figures, and these figures drew the attention of the people. So basically, first of all, answering your questions about people who reacted to what you put on the web. I mean, the guy is not even yet president. He will take over the presidency in August. On August 14, he'll become the president of Iran. Secondly, we need to give him a chance. He is an insider. He's not an outsider. He rose within the ranks of the Islamic Republic, but he's a centrist. You know, he has reached out to different groups. He has reached out even to the conservatives. You know, he keeps on referring to himself as the president of all Iranian. And his character, by nature, he's not in your face. And that was what Ahmadinejad was. And therefore, I agree with Afshin that the supreme leader will give him a chance, at least for a year, to see whether he can solve the economic and the foreign policy problems of Iran. This has been the pattern with the supreme leader. Every time he has a new president, he gives them a year to a year and a half, and then he starts intervening.
The change in tone that you described between Rouhani and Ahmadinejad, how much can that matter when it comes to foreign relations? You know, we are human beings, and relationships matter. Sure, there are technical reasons, and there are agendas that aren't always on the table, but how much can a change in tone have an impact?
You know, I've been watching the Saudi reaction to his election, and they just had a cabinet meeting Monday in Saudi Arabia, and they didn't say a word about Rouhani. I think we're in a period of a real showdown between the Gulf Arabs, led by Saudi Arabia and Iran, over Syria. And however, you know, you can make nice statements and hope for better relations, but the fact is they're in a showdown over Syria. And I don't know how nice words are going to make that any less of a reality in the coming months.
Are there any reactions to report on beyond Saudi Arabia and other regional neighbors or the United States, elsewhere? Anything of note that you've heard?
You know, I think that across the region there's a collective breath of sigh of relief. But as David notes,
because Ahmadinejad is gone?
Yeah. But as David notes, there's still significant structural geopolitical differences that Iran has with many regional states, and those are not going to go away. But I think tone does matter, to your point. I mean, if you look at President Mohammad Khatami and the tone that he brought, and he dramatically restored relations, and particularly with Saudi Arabia, that was the height of Iran-Saudi rapprochement. But as David notes, this isn't 1997 through 2005. The sectarianism that is exploding across the region is affecting Iran's relations, particularly with Sunni Arab states. And you know, so to them, Rouhani might be a band-aid that stops the bleeding of this rhetoric that's flying, you know, between Riyadh and Tehran, but not a solution.
But in his press conference and also in the speech he gave after he was elected, he specifically mentioned Saudi Arabia. He talked about, you know, reaching out to our neighbors, the Persian Gulf states, and mentioned Saudi Arabia. That was very important.
And this goes back to the endorsement you've noted, because Rafsanjani and Khatami endorsed Rouhani. Rafsanjani and Khatami maintain good relations with the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and I can guarantee you that messages are being conveyed to Riyadh from Tehran from Rafsanjani and Khatami.
For experts like the three of them, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm pessimistic that they're going to be.
Were you one of those commenters on the Facebook page? No. Using an alias?
You are, David. Are you pessimistic about Iran's changing its relations with the Saudis and the Persian Gulf countries? Or are you pessimistic about anything this poor guy can do?
No, that you can, in the midst of this confrontation over Syria, I mean, the Grand Sheikh in Saudi Arabia has just basically called for a jihad against the Assad regime. And everybody knows that Iran is a key supporter of Assad. So things are getting more confrontational. The level of rhetoric has gone way up. on the Sunni side as much as on the Shiite side, and on the Saudi side as much as on the Iranian side. Now, is that rhetoric going to be cooled now when the fate of Assad is now before everybody? I doubt it. But we would certainly hope that it would happen. And as you have pointed out, they had much better relations in the past.
I should tell our. Oh, sorry, David. I'm sorry to step on your last words there. But I should say to our viewers and listeners, when Haleh is offering this very compassionate view of this poor guy who hasn't been in office yet, this woman is no softie. This is someone who's been a political prisoner in Iran and has written about that. So anyone who gets the wrong idea that she's a softie, she is not. But before we run out of time, because we are getting into our final minutes, as I was about to say that. Three experts like you see all the nuance, all the overlap, all of the complexity. Much of the world looks at Iran and sees the nuclear issue. So let's spend the last minute or two on that. What do you have any expectations of change in regard to nuclear negotiations?
Well, I think that certainly the tone will change in the nuclear negotiations. I think Rouhani, to some extent, will say that his view has been vindicated, because when he was the chief nuclear negotiator, Iran had suspended uranium enrichment for a couple of years, and then he got a lot of flack for that, because they said he was an appeaser. But now he argues that, okay, you guys had the nuclear file in your hand for 8 years. Look what you've done. You've brought historic sanctions upon us. So he says, give the file back to me and let's see what we can do.
And solving the sanction problem, these are joined at the hip.
These are joined, yeah. But it's a long road ahead. I don't see a breakthrough happening in the next 6 months to a year.
But he has hinted that they should come clean.
Yeah, that's right.
And be more open. And that, I think, would help.
Yeah.
Relieve the tension over this issue.
Can he back up that promise if he's offering more openness?
I don't
You
know.
know, John, I think what he again said is that he talked about Iran's right to nuclear program. He didn't change that position, but he said Iran should come out, or will come out, there would be more transparency when it comes to the program. And it also depends who he is going to nominate as the negotiator. In the past, the negotiator would go to the supreme leader and the NSCN report. Having a president, Ahmadinejad, who didn't know anything about the nuclear program. While here, whoever the negotiator is will go back to Rouhani, who will understand and who will help him in the argument that they will provide to the supreme leader and to the National Security Council in Iran. But quickly, it's not a one-way thing. I think the West has to also give him an opportunity to take the right step.
Well, with that, we will leave it there, and we'll promise to come back and talk about it again once he's sworn in to office, right? Thanks for joining us.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When we return, our guest will be Alfredo Corchado, author of this book, Midnight in Mexico, a reporter's journey through a country's descent into darkness, right after this.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
Welcome back. Alfredo Corchado is a Nieman, Woodrow Wilson, and Rockefeller Fellow and is the Mexico Bureau Chief for the Dallas Morning News. He joins us to discuss his new book. Here it is, Midnight in Mexico. Alfredo, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask you, as a journalist, you take a very personal approach to this story, not the typical journalistic approach. If you could describe to us how you came to that decision to approach the book in such a personal manner.
You know, I've been a reporter for 20 years at the Dallas Morning News. I've been privileged to have a front row seat to history. And so I try to pride myself in trying to educate readers on both sides of the border about Mexico and about the United States, U.S.-Mexico policy. The idea of doing it at a different level, as a journalist, but also as a Mexican, as an American, was an opportunity that I thought, you know, maybe it'll enrich the understanding between both countries. As close as we are, United States and Mexico, we're bound by geography, by bloodlines. I often get the sense that we don't really know one another. We're still, in many ways, distant neighbors. Because of history between both countries. You have 1848. Mexico loses a big part of its history. There's always been this resentment. I think there's also a sense in the United States of, you look at Mexico and you think of a corrupt little country, et cetera. You kind of just focus on the beaches or other aspects of Mexico, the beauty of Mexico. But I don't think there's ever really been a sense of understanding. That's changing. I mean, you see that a lot. At the Morning News, we do a lot of polls, and we see how Mexicans are becoming much less nationalistic. Sovereignty is still a big issue, but they're much more open-minded. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to try to introduce my United States to Mexicans and my Mexico to the United States.
Was it comfortable to approach it in such a personal manner?
Not at all. I mean, it was, you get used to being a reporter, you're comfortable on the sidelines, and suddenly you're going back to revisit stories and remember how you felt.
You're part of the story.
You're part of the story, and you're trying to describe the pain and joy of being a Mexican and being an American. But being part of the story, especially at a difficult time when so many journalists have been killed, Mexican journalists, was also something that it gives you some doubt.
What motivated you in the face of death threats to essentially investigate your own death threats? What made you take this risk?
My initial reaction was, I have family on both sides of the border. Was this a real threat? Was it raw intelligence? Was it confirmed? So I asked.
So did you not take it seriously at first?
At first, when they call you, you're stunned,
mm-hmm.
and you're not sure what to do. And then I kept thinking, do I do what I've done before, which was leave the country? And I had left Mexico in other occasions, but this time the warning came from a trusted U.S. source, and I thought, this is serious. If they don't go after me, if I leave the country, and I'm exposing my relatives, will they send a message by going after one of them? So I felt it was important for me to spend some time in Mexico with constant communication with U.S. sources, carry my U.S. passport, because that gives me a kind of protection that a lot of my colleagues in Mexico don't have, and just talk to as many people as I could to try to figure out whether it was real or not. After a week, I thought, okay, I'm out, and I left. I came back to Mexico on several occasions, but obviously the fear was always there, and I eventually left Mexico, and as you introduced me earlier, I mean, I became a fellow in some of these places, and I think that provided a sense of, you saw Mexico through the lens of a little more distance.
Mm-hmm. Now, you describe quite a horrific set of numbers and circumstances as it relates to drug violence and other related violence, crime and violence. Recently, we've seen the Mexican government release figures suggesting there's been a drop in violence. Could you explain the disconnect that is at least superficially a disconnect?
About 100,000 people have been killed or disappeared during the administration of Felipe Calderon. The new government has come in since December 1st, and there's, I think, an effort to try to change the storyline, change the narrative. And I think they have every right to do that. I mean, there is another story in Mexico. There's also a more prosperous story in Mexico. But I continue to believe that until you take care of the security issue, security will undermine whatever potential you have on the economic front. There are some new numbers that have come out. But you also have critics who look at the numbers and say, well, the numbers really haven't changed that much. I think the government claims they're down by 14%. You talk to other academics and say, well, it's not really that different. I mean, the targets have changed, the regions have changed, so violence has moved from one region to another. But the problem, I think, remains as challenging as it was during the last administration.
What are some of the most surprising things that, for people, when they look into this issue? I'm thinking in terms of things like just the way that demand for drugs in the United States creates the situation in Mexico, or how U.S. gun laws factor into it. What are some of those things that may not appear on the surface but are really important to understand?
I think, I think one of the things that I found more intriguing in reporting this book, but also as a journalist in Mexico over 20 years, is seeing how Mexicans themselves are changing. I think for the longest time, they would blame U.S. demand. They would blame U.S. guns for creating the mess or the chaos in Mexico. I also see a Mexico now that's doing a lot more shaming their own authorities and saying, look, we'll always have demand in the United States. There'll always be a demand for something that's banned in Mexico. But we also have to deal with organized crime. We also have to deal with a lack of rule of law, a very, very weak judicial institutions, a conviction rate that's just under 5%. So I see Mexicans much more skeptical, trying to hold government much more accountable. And I think that's, it's kind of the beginning of a civil society that's trying to build from ground up.
So does your story end on a hopeful note? Are you optimistic that this can happen in our lifetime?
If I wasn't hopeful about Mexico, and particularly the Mexicans, I don't think I would be going back and forth to Mexico as a journalist. I mean, if someone who's received a death threat or has you become a target for cartels. I mean, some people ask me, do you have a death wish? And I keep saying, well, I don't. I mean, you have to be a lot more careful about what you do, and you have to measure the consequences. But I remain hopeful about the Mexicans. I believe that the story that they're trying to, what they're trying to do, is a story that we have to continue telling.
Well, thank you, and thank you for telling it in Midnight in Mexico.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.
The Dialogue continues on Facebook. Join us by visiting our page. Search Dialogue at the Wilson Center. You can also connect with us via Twitter by following @John Molesky. Finally, check out all the latest videos from the Wilson Center on YouTube at Woodrow Wilson Center.